And that's what being a reader is, right? You are saying what you're seeing. Welcome back to the show. My name is Angelica, and today we are talking about how you can improve your tarot readings, how you can go from being a great reader to a professional style reader. And I'm going to be talking about 5 things that I did, whether they were intentional or unintentional, during the process of becoming a professional tarot reader, kind of like transitioning my readings to a more professional style. The things that I did that really helped me. And I'm focusing here because there's like so many ways we could talk about this, right? We could talk about specifically like tarot tips, advanced tarot techniques. We could talk about intuitive development. We could talk about reading confidence, like being just a really confident reader, being confident about your predictions. But today we're going to kind of focus on a little bit more of well, I guess we're going to touch on all of them. Honestly, I'm like thinking about what we're going to talk about, and I'm like, we're kind of going to touch on all of those a little bit. But I could probably come up with like 20 tips for each. Like we could just talk about tarot and all the developmental stuff that I recommend over there. We could just talk about intuitive development, psychic development. We could talk about all of it, right? And we will be talking about all of it actually in my upcoming program. It's called Arcana Adepts, and it is designed for those of you who have been reading tarot for a while. Maybe you've been reading tarot even like semi-professionally for friends for a couple of years, and you want to transition your readings to a more professional style. You want to start a tarot reading practice, whether that be full-time or part-time. If you are looking to expand in your tarot abilities, you want to start your practice, you want to become a professional tarot reader, Arcana Adepts is for you. And it's like a small group intensive program that's going to be running throughout the course of the fall. Check out the show notes if you're interested in that, and let's just dive into the rest of the episode. So the first thing that I did that was so helpful for me is I started recording my readings. This is a tip that's kind of especially for when I was reading for myself. I would record my readings, and instead of just like pulling the spread, looking at the cards, and just like in my head going, oh yeah, that's probably about this in my life, that's probably about that, and not really saying anything when I was actually looking at the cards, what I did instead is I pressed record and I pretended that there was a client sitting across from me, right? And I pretended that these weren't my cards. They were my clients' cards. And I sat there and I would literally read it. And of course, there were certain things about my life that I knew. And I was like, oh, maybe this is about this. But instead of like just assuming that in my head, I would say it out loud for the recording. I would say, this is kind of feeling like it's about your career. This is kind of feeling like it's about your relationship with Hades. Does this resonate? Is this coming up, right? And I wouldn't like respond back to myself. It wasn't like this two-way conversation kind of situation. That'd be so funny if it was. But it was more of like me practicing dictating everything I was saying. And that was so helpful for me, because I think that when we kind of are in that transition period from like, going into doing readings professionally, sometimes there can be this gap where like you feel like you really need to sit and look at the cards for a while before you immediately start channeling those messages, or you maybe even get a little bit nervous and you just like want to look at the cards before you're like talking to the client. And sometimes that can be because that's what you do with yourself. When you read for yourself, you stop, you look at everything, you take your time. And I'm not against taking your time. I even think in client readings there's absolutely nothing wrong with going, hey, I'm just going to look at these cards for a little bit, and I'll tell you what's coming up for me first in a second, right? But doing this and like looking at the cards straight out and just starting to dictate what you're seeing is going to be super helpful, because again, it helps you deliver the message in a quicker way, especially if you're doing like, timed readings, whether they be at a shop or at a market or something. Like you're doing, most of them are timed, right? So if you have 15 minutes with a client, you want two things to happen, right? You want to be able to tap into their energy and to actually get those messages that they're wanting to hear or that they need to hear right up front. Um, and you also want to feel really confident in yourself that you are going to be able to see those things and they are going to come to the forefront for you in the reading. And I think that there is something to it about it being sort of a quick, concise process of entering into the reading. And so that's one thing that recording yourself and dictating all of your readings as though a client was sitting with you can help with. It really trains you to start picking up on things quicker, start, just like I said, just dictating what you're seeing. Just talk about what you're seeing, and even when you're sitting with a client and sometimes, I'm looking at the cards and I'm like, okay, there's a couple of cards here that are definitely pointing to something in terms of career or finances, right? And like that's really obvious to me up front. I just say that out loud, right? I say, oh, it really looks like there's a lot of stuff coming up right now in career. And then I say, okay, what's a deeper layer there? Like, what is something a little bit more specific about that? Like, what specifically are the cards saying about that career? We signify that there's career stuff going on. What's the deeper layer? And then I say, what's the deeper layer after that? And what's the deeper layer after that? And do any of the other cards or spread positions give us any information that can clarify what I'm seeing up front? And, I tend to go through this mental process with myself in the reading, always, asking myself, okay, let's get a little bit more information. Let's get a little bit more information. Let me pull a clarifier card. And all of this, for the most part, sometimes I don't dictate it all. Sometimes it's just, especially since I've been doing this for a while, it just like in my brain already starts to work that way and the messages start to come in and I'm like, oh yeah, I already know what this is without having to say it out loud. But it's also really helpful for the client to hear kind of like your intuitive process. And then they can always chime in and be like, actually, yeah, this is what's going on in my career. Or, yeah, I want to talk about my career. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're seeing? And it kind of creates this engagement. And it also, yeah, it just creates this environment where everything's kind of out in the open. Like you're saying what you're seeing. And that's what being a reader is, right? You are saying what you're seeing. And I think that sometimes new readers are like less likely to really just say everything that they're seeing. Maybe there's this self-doubt, maybe there's like, oh, I don't really know if that message is coming up. Maybe you're having this internal battle in your head where you're like, I can't tell what this card is about in this person's life and I know what this card means and it could mean all these things, but I'm just having trouble tapping into my intuition. This dictation process can really help with that. And you also start to learn, and this kind of goes into our second point. The second point is trusting that what needs to come through will come through. So what I mean by that, right? Trusting that what needs to come through comes through. Sometimes when we enter a reading, either as a client or as the person facilitating the reading, there's this kind of question of, will I be able to, or will this reader be able to sort of pick up on what it is that I really need to hear? Sometimes the client, and I'm sure you've been in this position before, sometimes you know exactly what you want out of the reading. Like you're like, okay, I really want to figure this, and this out. Whereas the reader, as the person facilitating that, you don't necessarily know all the time what the client's thinking. Sometimes the client might not even necessarily know exactly what they're looking for. Sometimes the client will be really communicative about that. Sometimes they won't, either because they don't know or because, for whatever reason, they prefer to say less in the reading or in the opening of the reading or in their notes when they book. And you might have certain policies on that. You might have certain feelings on that that are specific to your practice. But I just think it's helpful to, at the start of the reading, go, whatever is coming up here, even like if I'm getting a message right off the gate about something that is completely unrelated to what they asked me to do in the reading, or where they asked me to look, I say to myself, well, for some reason this message needs to come through. Maybe the client didn't even realize that they needed to hear that. Maybe it was an area of their life that they were not thinking about. It's kind of like I equate it to like when you're in a therapy session and you were like, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about this thing that happened this week. And then you end up kind of hitting a chord that's so much deeper, and you start talking about something so much deeper, and you're like, I couldn't have even been able to bring this up if I wanted to in this session. And that's kind of what happens in tarot sessions sometimes too. Obviously I'm not equating tarot to like a therapeutic session. I think that tarot can be a therapeutic experience, right? But it's obviously not a one-to-one equivalent to a therapy session. I think we all know that. I'm just kind of talking more about the experience, right? Of, not being able to bring up what ends up coming out because you didn't even really know that it was in there, or you just weren't thinking about that. So what I like to do at the start of readings to facilitate this is I like to pray over my cards. And I'm not like praying to a specific deity or a specific god. Sometimes if I'm reading for like a Hades devotee, sometimes I'll say a quick prayer to Hades over the cards, right? Because why not? We're talking about Hades. Maybe we'll talk to Hades in the reading or something like that. But when I pray over the cards, the prayer that I say is something along the lines of what needs to come through will come through, and help me convey this message in the way that we will both understand, the way that I will understand, the way that the client will understand. My goal is to have everybody kind of understand from their perspectives what's going on, right? Because as the facilitator, I kind of need to, I don't need to know the whole situation of what's going on in your life, but I need to know enough to be able to convey that to you effectively. And same with you, right? I need to be able to be using the language that you're going to resonate with, that's going to immediately signify, oh, Angelica's talking about this, and that's what we're doing here, right? And then along with that prayer, I say something like, what will come through needs to come through. And that kind of prayer ritual, it really helps me kind of like tap into the moment, tap into the energy. I feel really grounded after I do that. I feel really like submerged in the energy of the reading. And I find like immediately after that, I just start getting messages and things just start coming in very psychically, even as I'm just shuffling the cards. You could also have a system that you set up for yourself around, what those most important messages are that are coming out, or what those initial messages are. So sometimes what I like to do is I like to, as I'm shuffling, if I see a card, like I don't really like, I'm not like looking at them to try to get information before I pull them. But sometimes I'll just be shuffling the deck and a card will fly out, or I'll shuffle it in a way where I kind of like cut the deck and I see the two cards on the bottom or something. And basically the way that I have it set up in my practice is, if those cards intuitively making an impression on me, I will talk about them as maybe the most important thing that needs to come out of the reading, or the thing that's just coming out at the beginning that maybe even the client didn't necessarily tell me about, but it's just a message from spirit. It's just something that needs to come through. And the fact that it happens kind of right after that prayer signifies to me, oh, like I did the prayer, now let my mind be open for what that is for the client, and it really helps. And I also think it helps with my own, my own like leadership in the reading, my own confidence in the reading, of starting out and knowing exactly where I'm going. Like there's a system that I'm creating. Because sometimes you'll have a situation, right, where you'll just spend a lot of time talking about one thing, and if you don't have a system of how you move through the reading, sometimes it can be a little frustrating to just go, oh my gosh, I just used 45 minutes of our hour-long reading to just talk about this one thing, because I didn't, in my mind, I wasn't thinking about the next thing that we're going to do or where we were moving on from there. So the third thing that really helped my readings is I started making really deep connections with the cards. So I'm a pagan witch, and I find that having a deity work practice where I am working with these deities, I am connecting with them, I'm getting information from them, I'm seeing them as these huge, incredible, like multidimensional beings that can provide me with all sorts of things, including information and a relationship. I think because I have that type of a worldview in my spirituality, it makes it really easy for me to connect with things like symbols and zodiac signs and tarot cards from that same perspective, where I am tapping into those things and seeing them not just as like static symbols or, a list of correspondences. I'm seeing them as these living, breathing things, right? I see them as intelligences that are able to communicate with me and able to teach me. So, what I like to do is I like to, especially if I feel like I'm having a hard time connecting with a specific card, I will sit in a ritual, like I will cast a circle, open up a ritual, sit in the ritual with that card, and literally just ask the card, can you teach me about what you are, like what you do, how you function in readings, what you mean in readings? Can you talk about what you mean in this context in a reading, in this context, in that context? You can bring up previous situations where you felt kind of confused about that card, especially if there's a more recent example of like the other day I pulled the King of Cups and I was kind of like having trouble figuring out what the King of Cups was doing in my reading. You can say that to the King of Cups. Be like, "So, what were you trying to say? Let's start there." And then you can start interviewing them, start asking them questions about who they are, what they do. You can start asking them things like, if you were to describe your nature, if you were to describe how you function, if you were to tell me what life situations you specifically rule over or signify, like, let me know. And you can do this type of divination in a lot of different ways. If you have psychic abilities, which I feel like a lot of tarot readers do, in addition to reading the cards, I think you could even argue that reading the cards is a way to kind of channel your psychic abilities. I often see images in my mind. I'll get kind of little flashes of images. Sometimes I will get flashes of like words and sentences. I'm not necessarily like hearing things externally. I'm not like, oh, the King of Cups, he's standing next to me and I can hear him. It's not really like that, but it's more of like, I'll just kind of tap into like my head, and through my psyche and through my subconscious, I can sort of start to hear what that voice sounds like. You know how like sometimes with captions, like especially right now on like Instagram and TikTok, the captions, it'll like flash like one word at a time, but it's like keeps flashing it and it keeps moving forward. Sometimes that's what happens when I'm like getting messages or hearing messages from deities or tarot cards or whatever, right? Is I'll almost like see it like captions. Like it'll be like the frog jumped over the brown fox or whatever, like word by word by word. And I'll do that, right? I'll like tap into that and I'll go, okay, King of Cups, what did you mean in my last reading? And I'll see a word and I'll see a word after that. And sometimes it's like a total full grammatical sentence. Like it's just there's a sentence, right? And sometimes it's a little bit more of just, like I have to fill in some words and I have to, you know, focus and kind of figure out what they're trying to say. So that's what I do. You can also use a pendulum. You can like hold a pendulum over the card and ask yes or no questions. You can use the rest of the tarot. Another thing I love to do is take the King of Cups, right? Ask him these questions, then put him back in the deck and shuffle it and shuffle it and shuffle it. And go in the deck and look for him. And whatever card is, on either side of him are the answers to what it is that you are asking. You could always specify that even further, where like the card on the left is going to signify, the more external or the more internal life situation that you embody. And then the card on the right is the more external life situation, right? And you can use tarot itself to help to get to know these cards. You can also just ask the cards to show up in dreams, come to you in dreams, and kind of like take you on a ride. You can work with the card like it is a portal for spirit. And a lot of people believe that tarot is kind of this portal for spirit. And what I believe is that, each card has a certain essence to it. has a certain intelligence to it, and we can use the card itself almost like a pentacle or some type of sigil or like a Solomonic pentacle or something. We can use that card as a way to kind of like conjure and allow the intelligence that's behind that card to come in and talk with us or work with us in some way. So, a lot of people will do spell work with tarot, and I think that tends to be like the worldview around doing it. Other than the fact that, you might want the 10 of Pentacles in a career spell, because the 10 of Pentacles might, especially to you, convey some type of like career actualization. But there's another worldview there where maybe there is a spirit that is of the intelligence of the 10 of Pentacles, and they can actually help you almost more in a petition-based way to achieve career success, right? So wherever you're at on that, you don't fully have to believe that tarot is like a portal for these intelligences, but that's how I like to work with them. The way that I think about, especially the minor arcana, is through the decans. I really link up the decans, which I think, it is like a thing that people do. I'm not making this up. I'm not making up the decan thing, right? That's just like a correspondence of tarot. But you can work with the planets that rule over each card through the decans, and work with those planets as the intelligence of that card. So maybe instead of the Six of Cups being like having a specific separate intelligence, you could work with the sun, because that card is in the decan of the sun, something like that. I also think that reflecting on your readings is really helpful. So that step before can come after you've reflected on your readings and you were like, okay, what the fuck does this card mean? But I just think the process of reflecting back on all readings is amazing, and that's the fourth thing that's really helped me advance in my readings. I really like to think of the times in my client practice when a card was really loud and a client really resonated with that message, whether that have been I interpreted that card very differently than I usually do, and the client really resonated with it, or whether that be like, a classic interpretation of that card was coming up in my reading, and the client was like, yeah, that's so what I'm experiencing right now. Even things that don't go as well, like situations where I'm talking about what I'm seeing and the client is maybe having a harder time connecting with the message, and what I ended up doing to get them on the same page, or what specifically was coming up that they weren't connecting with, and then how I kind of like solved that problem or started to, kind of get more on the wavelength that they were on as well. I like to write that down too and reflect on that. So if you have a client practice, if you're starting a client practice, if you are even like reading for friends, or maybe you're reading at a market, I would really recommend, writing down briefly after each reading, like what you thought was really easy and simple about that reading, what you thought was a little bit more difficult, what the client really resonated with, what they didn't resonate with out front. And if you're reading for yourself, instead of just pulling a card and kind of doing like a daily pull and then writing about that, instead of that, what I want you to do, again, press record, record the reading, dictate it like you're with a client. And then after that, you've dictated the whole reading, so you have that in your records as what the reading was about. After that, write down from your perspective as both the client and the reader what you thought was the most helpful, what you had a hard time interpreting, what you might still not understand about the reading, what you had to clarify, what cards specifically were giving you trouble. And then again, you can maybe set up a ritual and talk to those cards. You can maybe follow up in a reading in a couple of days. Maybe you can just put it on the table that, you had a hard time with these things, and see how that changes, or see how the messages starts to come through. This is like a totally separate step. So maybe this will be the fifth one, the fifth and final. But I think that also Having an awareness of how your readings land is really helpful. And this can be both in terms of your dictation and how you say things. This could be in terms of the spreads that you choose to use. And this can also be like, are you the type of reader that tends to pick up on more current messages, more future messages? Are you channeling from the past? Are you talking to their spirit guides? And that's how you're able to channel. Really kind of figuring out, like, how do I accomplish this? What is my style? You know, what can my client expect, and how can I potentially convey that to the client in advance so that they know how to be a client of mine, so that they know and they can expect how the messages are going to come through for them. Maybe you're the type of reader where, and you learn this through listening to your readings back, reflecting on your readings, maybe even asking for client feedback, asking for friends' feedback. You realized that you tend to pick up on things that haven't happened yet. And sometimes it can be confusing in the moment for the client, right? Like sometimes you're like, damn, I'm so good at predicting stuff, but why, whenever I sit with a client, why is it really difficult for them to understand what I'm saying? Or why do I always feel like I'm kind of battling with my client around whether or not things are happening in their life, you know? You now have the information that you're a future reader. So you can say to the client, like, oh, I am this type of reader. I'm a future reader. So some of the things that I say in this reading are not going to make sense right now. And that's the whole point. So, you know, call me in a month. And if things still don't make sense, then maybe we can talk, right? But it's not supposed to make sense. And you learned that because you thought about your reading style and you reflected on your reading style. This is something we're going to work on in Arcana Adepts, is really pinpointing like what your style is. And we're just going to kind of discuss how you read, how it differs from other people. So that's something that we're going to work on together in Arcana Adepts. All of these things we're going to work more together on in Arcana Adepts. We're also going to be doing a ritual where we're talking to cards and trying to get deeper messages from them. So I'm going to show you like my in-depth method for doing that. We're going to talk about what type of reader you are. We're going to go so deep in this intensive program. You're going to be a better reader afterwards. I hope to see you in Arcana Adepts. It is such a cool program. It starts in like mid-October and it runs until late December. You can check out the show notes and hop into the program. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode and this video. I hope it was helpful for you to start thinking about how you can grow and expand in your readings and go from being a great reader to being a professional style reader. We will talk very, very soon. And if you're not following me over on Instagram, make sure you are, because I post daily stories, post a ton of content over there. And I just hit 75K followers on Instagram. So I'm going to be doing a 75K Instagram podcast Q&A celebration thing. So that's going to be fun. So look out for that in an upcoming episode.